Go ahead and make your way over to Ephesians chapter 6. Last week, we talked about how that as Paul is bringing this letter to a close, he ends it with two great lessons on strength. The first of those is a little harder to see than the second one. The first one, as we talked about last week, is submission. That it takes the strong person to submit to the plan of God and thus to submit to others. The second, not quite so hard to see, because if we look here in chapter 6, verse 10, he says, finally, be strong. So we know that lesson on strength is coming. What's interesting, though, about this last part of the book of Ephesians is it's one of those passages where often you've got a section of it pulled out of its context. We often talk about what we call the Christian armor or the armor of God, and that's fine. I mean, it's not a problem to talk about that on its own. But yet, what we must understand is that it is a piece of this final admonition that the apostle gives to the Ephesians and consequently to us. And it tells us how that we stand firm in that day of testing. And so that's what I'd like for us to discuss this morning as we finish out our study here on the book of Ephesians. As we think about what we're standing against, there's an old admonition that says, know your enemy. Know who you're fighting. And I hope as we've gone through the book of Ephesians, we have seen how that the apostle in almost every chapter, I think every one except one, has talked about this enemy that surrounds us, that we face on a daily basis. Let's just take a quick little review of that. In chapter 1, as the apostle is talking about the great sacrifice of Jesus and the plan of God, about that plan, he says he worked it in Christ Jesus when he raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion and above every name that is named, not only in this age, but in the age to come. And so here's our opening salvo. The apostle says there are these rulers and authorities and powers and dominions, and they are not for you. They are for your destruction. He continues that in chapter 2 with a specific name for one of those rulers and authorities, when he says, in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, which is kind of another way of talking about the heavenlies that are spoken of throughout the book. Here is the prince of the power of the air who is against you. And in chapter 3, when he comes to really the central part of the book and the central theme, he talks about the grand plan that you and I know in salvation. He says, so that through the church, the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. And we made the point then that when we are baptized, we are announcing not only to those in our midst, but to all of these rulers and authorities on whose side we stand. And that's Jesus Christ. Now, chapter 4 does not specifically mention these powers, but it gives us an idea. When in verse 14 he says, so that we are no longer children, tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning. So we're kind of on a human level now, but note the force behind it. By craftiness in deceitful schemes. A word that's going to come out in chapter 6 again. And then as we reach somewhat of the finale of all of these warnings about the enemy, we come to chapter 6, and in verse 12, the apostle says, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. The apostle has sought to make a point to us, and that is to know your enemy. So let's break that down just a bit and discuss it. When we come to chapter 6, verses 12 and 13, and as he begins this this kind of wrap-up of who it is we're fighting, the first line may be a little bit surprising to us when he says, your fight is not against flesh and blood. And the reason that's surprising, perhaps, is because that's who we face, that's who we see, isn't it? We see those who oppose our righteousness, we see those who persecute the people of God. But as the apostle is getting to the heart of the problem, he says, realize that in the long run, your fight is not against them. And he goes on to say, your fight is over the cosmic powers of this present darkness. Now, once again, we're wrapping a theme up to a climax here. Starting in chapter 4, we've been talking about this darkness. When in verse 18 of chapter 4, he says, they are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardness of their heart. And he says in verse 8 of chapter 5, at one time you were darkness. You were on their side. But now you are light in the Lord. Walk then as children of light. And in verse 11, the warning, take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. The apostle says you are dealing with the cosmic powers of the present darkness. Take them seriously. He then says, you're fighting against these spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places, or the heavenlies is how the literal term would be. It's kind of like throughout the air, you've got this prince of the power of the air, you've got these rulers and authorities. You need to make sure you understand who you're fighting against. And his language here is helping us to get somewhat of a non-earthly view. Whereas the temptation might be to think I'm fighting against this flesh and blood, the apostle says, wait a minute. You understand that these spiritual forces of evil are in the heavenly places surrounding you. And there's kind of that allusion back to the prince of the power of the air. Now, there is a very grave danger if we take this lightly. Interesting that in the cultural times in which we live, there is a push to minimize this enemy. As I was kind of working over these thoughts in my mind, I couldn't help but think about the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. If you have never read those, read it. It's a tremendous work of writing. But just a little background of that, the book is written as those two demons are corresponding with each other. A senior demon writing a junior demon. And he's giving him all of this advice on how to destroy who they'll call the patient in the book, this man who's being tempted. And at one time, as the Uncle Screwtape is writing, he says this, in the meantime, we must obey our orders. I do not think that you will have much difficulty in keeping the patient in the dark. The fact that devils are predominantly comic figures in the modern imagination will help you. If any faint suspicion of your existence begins to arise in his mind, suggest to him a picture of something in red types and persuade him that since he cannot believe in that, it's an old textbook method of confusing them, he therefore cannot believe in you. Since the age of enlightenment, the Western mind has worked to eliminate anything that it cannot readily explain. And part of the cost of that has been this view of the enemy that the apostle has warned us about. Now, we take that a little more seriously and bring it down to us when it can be that because of the larger cultural ignoring of that enemy, our focus on the evil forces is also not very serious. How many times do we view The devil, kind of like the screw tape letters describes, we think about the horns and the pitchfork and the pointed tail and almost this comic book character figure, and we think that demons are nothing more than the fodder of a good Hollywood movie these days, that somehow somebody's come into contact and it's a good storyline. And the parlor games where we think about contacting the dead, even though God in the Old Testament said have nothing to do with that kind of thing. And if we are not very careful, our suave, cultured, modern minds, says to the Apostle Paul, that was all well and good for those first century people, but we are different. Those things don't impact us. And when we get to that point, we are indeed in trouble. Because the apostle has spent the entirety of this letter reminding us of the power of the enemy that we face. And so what the apostle says is, when I tell you about rulers and authorities and cosmic powers over this present darkness and the prince of the power of the air, you better listen to what I'm saying to you. Because these are the ones who want to destroy you. And the way that they destroy is to convince that they are right and not God. And so 2 times in the letter, he addresses those who are in that situation as the sons of disobedience. And we'll get into a little bit more of that tonight as we think about the Lord's words in all of this. And so his point then is, to go back to chapter 4, verse 27, give the devil no opportunity. Don't play around with these things. Don't take them lightly. Understand the seriousness of who you're fighting. But one thing the apostle did not say is he never said to fear them. Did you notice that? He says lots of things, but never does he say, you need to really fear. Well, there's a reason for that. Because when you read the remainder of chapter 6, you understand that you very much can be equipped to handle it. And thus, dropping back to verse 10, we find that opening admonition to be strong in the Lord. By the way, this is our 6th of the 7th uses of this within the book. This idea of being in the Lord. Be strong in the Lord. And then he says, be strong in the strength of His might. Which takes us back almost to the beginning of the book, where he draws this picture of Jesus Christ and he says, it is here that you find your strength. Now, the point that the apostle makes back there in the beginning part of the book, and the New Testament makes throughout, is that if you are looking for the source of strength to take on these enemies, it's going to be in the one who conquered them. It's going to be the one who's fought them and won. And so we think about, even as we've done this morning, the death and the burial and the resurrection of our Lord, and that it is within them, in those actions, that the victory has been achieved. Thus, the apostle says, you need to put on the right armor. And so we look now to what this passage states. And I want to just put this up on the screen for us to see. We'll not spend a lot of time here. But what he says is taken almost verbatim from Isaiah 59. As Isaiah is talking about the Lord, it says he looked around and he saw no justice, and he saw that there was no man who could intercede. Then his own arm brought him salvation, and his righteousness upheld him. Now listen to this. He put on righteousness as a breastplate and a helmet of salvation on his head. He put the garments of vengeance for clothing. The only thing not given to us is vengeance. That belongs to God. He wrapped himself in zeal as a cloak. According to their deeds he will repay. Wrath to his adversaries, repayment to his enemies. And then God says, when you talk about fighting these enemies, what I want to do is to give you the weaponry that's going to protect you. And so the apostle then says in verse 11, put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against, and here is our word that we alluded to earlier, against the schemes of the devil, which should take us directly back to Genesis 3, where we find the devil seeking to bring down humanity. What an interesting word. A term that suggests, as one put it, a calculated and intentional effort to deceive or mislead, which would have been familiar to those in a society accustomed to warfare and political intrigue. It's a predictable method, which is where we get our word method from this, used to organize evil-doing, well-crafted trickery. The devil has a plan too. The forces of evil have a plan. And the apostle says the only way you're going to survive this is if you put on the armor of God so that you can withstand those schemes of the devil. And so then, with that right armor on, we can stand. Let's look at our text now and see how the apostle surrounds this idea. He says, first of all, put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. Then our enemy is there. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. And now the apostle almost repeats himself. Therefore take up, here's our term, the whole armor of God, but now a tweak, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm, returning to that earlier word. The word withstand is the idea of resistance. We think about that militarily. The resistance means you are doing everything within your power to bring the enemy down. The word stand is more of that idea of when the battle is in your face, you're not backing up one bit. And this is what the apostle tells us that we must do. So as we stand firm, as we put on the armor of God, we understand then all of these concepts. That the armor of truth and righteousness and peace and faith and salvation and the Word of God, that's how we stand against this enemy. That's the resistance movement against the enemy. That we are leaving where they are, we're coming to the side of Jesus Christ. Now, let's take all this and put it together. The apostle has warned us about the enemy. The apostle has told us how to survive the enemy. He's already told us earlier in the book that we are seated with Christ in the heavenly places, yet we've got to understand something. That while in a sense it is as if we have entered into eternity already, that we are going to be with Jesus Christ from the moment of our baptism forever. He also wants us to understand it's not the fullness of eternity. That while you have this relationship that will never be broken, it's not exactly like it's going to be one day, because one day we are not going to have to deal with evil. There's not going to be these rulers and authorities and cosmic powers of darkness and the prince of the power of the air. One day we don't have to deal with it, but until then, we are under attack. Now, give me a little artistic liberty on this next illustration. But if we wanted to kind of picture maybe what this is looking like. Here we are, we're on earth. We've read about all of these great scenes of the throne room of God, but now the apostle has said, in the heavenlies, you got this prince of the power of the air, you've got the authority, you've got the spiritual forces, you've got the rulers. And it's almost like the apostle is saying, just realize you're surrounded by all of this. But what he says in chapters 1 through 3 is you don't have to worry. Because what's happened is Christ has come. And by the very fact that He has come to earth, He has invited you into His kingdom. He's invited you into His protection. And for all who are willing to take Him at His offer, by the way, you are now seated with Christ in the heavenly places. Still got the rulers, still got the authorities, still got the prince of the power of the air, but you don't have to worry. Because Christ has already defeated all of them. And when you sit with Christ, though they are still trying to attack, though they are still trying to get you to deny Him, when you sit with Jesus Christ, you are okay. But the other point is there are a lot of people who don't accept Jesus Christ. And these sons of disobedience have accepted the kind of life, the kind of teaching that works against that of Jesus Christ. And so, when we're facing this, it may be a human face we're seeing, the Apostle Paul is saying, and that person's going to stand in judgment for it, no doubt. But he says, understand, your fight is not against them. Your fight is against those who want to destroy your faith. So the Apostle says, just understand there's two lines of attack. The first thing the enemy wants you to do is to separate yourself from Jesus Christ. If the enemy can get you to do that, for your life, the battle's won. And so that's why Paul spent all that time in chapters 1 through 3 saying in these grand terms, this has been done so that you can be saved. This is so that right now you can sit with Jesus Christ in the heavenly places until that final enemy is put under His feet and you enter into eternity in its absolute fullness. That's the message. So then, the enemy will try to minimize that. He'll try to point to every problem you have in your life and say, obviously God has no care for you. You get sick, you lose a family member, you have all these problems occurring. Does that really sound like a God who loves you? Does that really sound like you're sitting with Jesus Christ in the heavenly places? And after all, can you really even believe there is a God? Isn't that outdated? Isn't that some old-fashioned notion? And I wonder over the past 2,000 years how many Christians have got up from their seat with Jesus Christ and given themselves to the enemy. We cannot be those people. As chapter 4 so well tells us, we must be a people who remain in the light. That we are discerning, as the text says, what is pleasing to God. But that second line of attack is that he wants to separate us from each other. While chapters 1 through 3 have magnificently explained this great picture of salvation, chapters 4 through 6 have said, you got to make sure that you're sticking together. Be unified. Be one. And chapters 4, 5, and 6 deal with that, coming to a very fitting culmination here with the giving of the armor of God, which we're going to employ our good southern language to get the full intent of this. The Apostle Paul is saying, y'all put on the armor. This is not an individual fight. You are standing as the army of God. And that's where He wants us. to understand that as the army of God, we are dependent on each other. And if we have this idea of, I'm going to go around and I'll be a Christian, but I'm going to live in my isolated world and I don't really have the time or interest for all of these other people, we are setting ourselves up for destruction. And thus, as the apostle comes to the conclusion of that section of putting on armor, verse 18, he says, praying at all times in the Spirit, with all prayer and supplication, to that end keep alert with all perseverance, making supplication for all the saints. That's standing together. And there are a lot of us in this room who have felt and know the strength of those prayers. That because we have an army surrounding us who have put on the armor of God, they're looking out for us. And in turn, we look out for each other. You see, strength is found in unity. And so we pull all of this together. And the apostle says to us in chapter 5, make the best use or better, redeem the time, because the days are evil. And as he's drawing all this to a conclusion, he says, therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in that evil day. You see, the forces of evil seek our destruction. Christ seeks our salvation. And the apostle says, you make sure you understand where you need to be standing, so that in that evil day, having done all, you can stand. And as the apostle told the Ephesians, so he tells us, grace be with all of you who love our Lord Jesus Christ with love incorruptible. What a magnificent book that opens us up to the mind of God, to show us our enemy, to show us His power over the enemy, to show us His love, His desire for our salvation. And how could we not come to Him after realizing what's been done so that we can be saved? And I hope for those who are strong in the Lord, this has been a good rallying cry study for you these past few weeks. And that you're ready to work to be even stronger in the Lord. And I so hope for any who are struggling with that decision, who are listening to all of these lies of the prince of the power of the air, that you're ready to put those aside and to take your seat in the heavenly places under the protection of Jesus Christ until the day that you join Him eternally. And that can be done this morning by confessing your belief in Him and saying, I know who has won this fight and I know whose side I want to be on. And to be buried in the waters of baptism and the sins be taken from you and an announcement made throughout this universe, I stand with Jesus Christ and I will not turn back. I hope if you're ready to do that, you'll do that this morning. And you can do so now as we stand and sing together.